Warren and Charlie talk a lot about the importance of incentive structures for their managers, and I know you've had the benefit of speaking directly with a lot of them. They speak more theoretically. I wondered if you could give us some specific examples with some of the managers that you've spoken with on, hurdle rates or what those compensation structures would be for some of the managers in specifics.
When I look back and count up the most frequently asked questions, that's got to be in the top 3. And I think the best answer to that question is a one-word answer, which is rationality. All of the compensation packages are done in a totally rational way, and I think it really captures what Tom Russo was saying earlier about there are, the relevant sets of incentives that are relevant to particular businesses that differ across businesses. At a See's Candy type of place where you have very high inventory turnover and a high degree of seasonality, it might make different metrics would be appropriate than for a company that makes flight simulators and then uses them to train pilots. But my clear sense is that the deal is that the pay is tied to important value drivers that are under that person's control. And my other insight is that they tend to be multi-period. These are not one-off, one-year kinds of things, but instead are multi-period. And again, I think it's tailored to the business. Candy's selling at a lot higher rate than cargo is used, for example. But they have otherwise, I think, generally kept those things confidential. And but here I don't see any problem with it. I mean, there was a revelation when David Sokol got into trouble about his pay scale. I think he'd earned $20 million, which, for a company of the size doing the kind of things he was doing is within corporate America, it's not obscene. Let's put it that way. So I think it's totally rational, and I think Warren is very happy. I mean, I think the pay of Todd and Ted is disclosed. I think they would $1 million a year fixed, and then like 10% over some certain rate of return. So I think that they're reasonable, they're rational, they're sensible, but that people can also make a lot of money. They become affluent in this company.
Hi, Larry. Thanks for your comments. Given the number of years you've followed Warren, and particularly his essays, can you comment on trends or growth in the thematic content? Does he become more of himself? Does he sprout new core themes?
There's both. And I think that Byron Trott talked about this or alluded to it in a pair of his comments. There's a singularity to it, a consistency to it, a clear point of view, a clear philosophy, some things that clearly don't change. There's a difference between price and value. Market price can be out of whack with value. I mean, there's the sense of shareholders as owners, the sense of managers as stewards of shareholder capital. Some of these points are fixed and permanent, and they don't change. He might use, with Carol's input, use slightly different formulations, but there's some very fundamental core ideas that are repeated in different ways all the time. Observations about human behavior, observations about incentives, observations about the institutional imperative, that is the propensity of a business organization to follow the lead of a CEO, even if it's not an attractive path. So some of those core principles seem to remain immutable. The scope of commentary has indeed grown. I think that he has always had on the agenda, important points to make about the prevailing topics of corporate America, and so I think you saw a lot of really neat essays on accounting back in the 80s, and then you saw a lot of really neat ones on mergers and acquisitions in the 90s. You saw a heavier dose of corporate governance topics in the early 2000s. You certainly then get, these were the gestalts of the era. I mean, these are the important things that most people in corporate America were kind of preoccupied with, and so he wrestles with those, comments on them. They tend, though, to be durable, too. I mean, you can extract these lessons that are period-based, but they're pretty transcendent. And then I think there has also been a greater macro willingness. And so, especially in the last 15 years, you see greater meditation upon the housing industry and how we finance it, or the U.S. trade deficit, how we deal with that. And again, I think those things tend to be discrete, period-based things, but that have transcendent significance. So yeah, I think you see these permanent features and these contextual ones all at the same time.
Hi, Lawrence. You mentioned briefly the partnership with 3G Capital. How do you see the alignment of the culture of Berkshire and the culture of 3G Capital, and how could this reflect on the development of this particular partnership and possibly similar partnership in the future for Berkshire?
Well, Warren has been friends with Jorge and those guys for 30 or 40 years. They served, Jorge and Warren served on the board of Gillette Company together back in the 70s, and so Warren has great admiration for his integrity, his business savvy, and so on. And so again, when those opportunities came from 3G to Berkshire, Heinz is the first, Kraft is the second, he had trust and confidence in the fellow bringing the deals to him. My own take on those two deals, which is very different from everybody else's. Well, first I'll give his. Tom Gaynor has said that when pressed at the annual meeting last year about, well, when 3G is at Heinz or now at Kraft, its business model includes cutting the headcount, and sometimes pretty aggressively. And Warren said, well, and Charlie backed him on this, that if there's a bloated headcount, it should be reduced. That business is not operated to employ people at less than full employment. And if a Berkshire company had that problem, he said, I hope it will be fixed. I think, the difference I see is that Berkshire has never acquired a company knowing it had a bloated headcount with a plan to save money by reducing it. And with Heinz and Kraft, that's part of the plan. So, but my own view about this is that these positions are not wholly owned positions. I mean, when I think about Berkshire Hathaway and the corporate culture that animates this organization and this sense of partnership, I'm talking about the wholly owned companies. I'm talking about Seas and Marmon, BH Energy, the 60 or 80 wholly owned subsidiaries for which Berkshire is 100% responsible. With the investees, which include Coca-Cola, Berkshire is not responsible for how those companies operate. And I would put Kraft and Heinz, it's right on the line. It's 50-50. It's not wholly owned. It's partly owned. And 3G is in charge of those two companies. It has carte blanche to make all of these decisions. And so my view is during this period of partial ownership, it is just like an investee, a minority position. And it's not really Berkshire's responsibility. If and when 3G improves Heinz and Kraft, Berkshire, I understand, at least will consider buying the rest of it. And if and when Berkshire does that, then it assumes total ownership, total control, total responsibility. So I like the model. I think it's a very neat model. I don't see any inconsistency with Berkshire policy. I don't see it as a blemish, other than that it has produced a certain degree of scrutiny.
So in The Intelligent Investor, Benjamin Graham allocates about one paragraph to the 20-year-old. He says that the young capitalist should focus on finding deviations between price and value, not beating the market. So having such an understanding of Buffett's annual letters, if he were to write one paragraph to the young capitalist today in 2015, what would be his challenge?
Oh, well, that's a great question. Thanks for that great question. I should stress, Warren is very interested in childhood education, adolescent, collegiate education, especially in finance. And he has supported or co-sponsored a book about finance for younger people. So that might be a good place to look to get a really good answer. I mean, in other words, I think he's he's given the advice that you described or that you've sought. And I just don't have I haven't a vision of that book in my head, but you might check that out. But he's given a lot, and there are other sources better than me where you might look. He has given numerous speeches to student groups, many of which are taped and available online. And I've watched a few of those, and they contain very motivating, sage advice. So pardon my punt, but I wouldn't be as good a source as those original sources. Any other questions? Well, if not, I want to thank all of you very much for your kind attention and those very good questions too.